All right, so I'm going to talk about seminar courses. So I'm thinking about your classes that are 60 people or less generally. So the idea is that in these classes, we're usually wanting students to engage with the content, to develop their critical thinking skills, and to contribute to discussions, right? So a lot of my techniques that I'm going to tell you about are how do you get college students, to talk in discussion. All right, so first, my definition of inclusive teaching, right? So I think of inclusive teaching as all students feeling like they have an important contribution to make to the classroom and that they feel comfortable making that contribution. Now, we can think about what we want students to do in the classroom in different ways, but I feel like this is kind of the baseline. It's like, you have something to say, and I just want you to say it. You know, you don't need to feel necessarily safe making it, but at least can you feel like, I'm going to put this out there and see what happens, right? That's where I want students to kind of start at. And then eventually I want them to feel excited about their contribution, to feel really smart when they're contributing. So how do I do that? I'm going to talk about a seminar that I taught this last quarter, which is called Growing Up in Pan Am, the Developmental Psychology of the Hunger Games, and some of the practices that we did in that classroom, where I feel like we did create an environment where everyone felt really excited about being part of the discussion. So some things that you can do. First, set guidelines. Second, make the discussion personal. And then vary the discussion style. And I'm going to go through each of these. All right, so guidelines. The idea of setting guidelines for discussion, as you might have heard this before, is that you want people to feel like, oh, this is a comfortable place to say my opinion, right? And so what I usually do at the beginning of class, at the beginning of the quarter, is to really say, okay, what can we do to help everyone feel comfortable? And then they can generate guidelines, and they usually end up like these. But the idea is that the guidelines are coming from them, and that they are able to say, well, this is what I need to feel comfortable. Like, I need to know that people aren't going to yell at me, right? I mean, most people will come up with this idea, like, can we just be accepting of what someone says? Like, challenge me, but don't yell at me. Or I would really, if it's a class about like an identity or some sensitive topics, it's like I'd like to feel like this, what I say is not going to be shared outside of this room, right? So that's sometimes what people are looking for. But if you can come to these guidelines as a class, then that helps students feel comfortable because like, hey, we all agreed that this is what we are going to do. So that's really like one of the first steps and the first laying the groundwork of how do you get people to feel comfortable speaking. So the second thing is to make people feel like they have something important to contribute. And that's where making the discussion personal is really useful. So a lot of when I first start the discussion, I just ask questions. What did you think about this? What questions do you have about it? Right, you are starting the discussion not with what was the author's main point, but with how did you feel about this, right? And you don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but by starting with what was your reaction to this reading or to this topic, you are making it known to them that you care about how they felt about it. You care about what they are thinking in their heads about it. And later on, you can challenge and say, okay, well, here was, what the main point was. Can you tell me your thoughts about, get into the more theoretical questions. But if you start out with what was your reaction? Gut reaction. How did you feel about it? Did you like it? Things like that. That privileges their feelings first. It says, oh, I'm supposed to be responding to this. I'm not just listening to the instructor telling me how to feel about this. It's okay for me to have a feeling about this, and it's okay for me to share that feeling. Another way to do this is with an ending reflection. So at the end of the day, so at almost every class, in the Hunger Games class, I had them write 200 words on what happened today, right? And it really was the case of just tell me whatever. Like there's no structure to it. I just want you to write 200 words. And sometimes they would just describe, well, first we did this activity, then we did this activity. But later on, it became, well, we did this, and I felt like this. And then I had a question about this, and I talked to my neighbor about this, and I thought this was really interesting, right? So again, you're just putting it at the forefront that their opinion matters and that you care about their opinion. And the cool thing is, you don't even have to grade it, Right? You can just get a checkpoint if they did it, and it serves a lot of purposes. All right, and then my last tip is about varying the discussion style. So a lot of times in seminars, the the discussion is let's sit in a circle, right? The instructor is kind of the focus of the circle, and then you ask a question and you expect students to respond in the big group, or sometimes you put them into small groups. And there are definitely students who feel comfortable already just coming to our classroom and feel comfortable doing that. But there's some students who don't feel comfortable doing that, and there's some students who are never going to speak in that kind of setting. So how do you get them to contribute? You give them other opportunities to do so. So some of the real benefits of small group discussions are that you get to hear from voices that may not be usually spoken up. You kind of get to have a more in-depth discussion. But the disadvantage is, of course, that not everyone is part of that discussion. So the fishbowl is an excellent way to have that small group discussion, but have everyone see what is going on. So the idea of the fishbowl is that you put 6 to 8 students in the middle of the classroom, right? So you put them in the middle, and everyone else is sitting around, and they are going to observe the discussion, right? And this can be very intimidating, it's true. But that's why when I do this, I really, I kind of softball the questions, right? First we do it with like, oh, tell us about, so we were talking about gender socialization. Tell me about, what messages did you get about being a girl or being a boy growing up, right? So that's something that's personal. First, also, it's easy to talk about. Everyone has some story about what it's like growing up. But later on, you can move to those deeper questions once you've established that comfort. But the idea here is that you get all the students to recognize, oh, my classmates have some interesting things to say, right? Everyone gets to hear what is said, and the people who are in that fishbowl get to feel like, oh, people, are listening to me, and people are responding to me, and you as the instructor get to observe that. So I do variations on this, so sometimes I will sit in the circle with them and kind of guide them, and sometimes I'll be outside of the circle. But the real purpose here is to have the students feel like, oh, I can say something, but then for your students who are outside the circle to appreciate what the people inside the circle have to say. And we usually rotate through the circles too, so everyone gets to be in the bowl. Okay, so then the next one is the silent discussion, and that's what this picture, oh, it's not rotated. Well, anyway, that's what this picture is here. So basically what we did was to, not everyone is comfortable speaking out loud. So in this class, I put pieces of paper on the wall. They had discussion prompts, and they had to write. And they were not allowed to speak for an hour. We went around writing. And so the idea here was that everyone has to contribute, right, because they had to keep walking around and keep reading. But for some people, it's easier to take the time to formulate that thought and to write it out than to have to speak it. But then they could still respond to each other. So, and it's somewhat anonymous, it's not completely, but it's another way just to engage. And then the last one is the speed discussion. And the great thing about this is how do you get people to appreciate that their classmates have really interesting viewpoints? You just make them talk to each other one-on-one for 2 or 3 minutes, right? And the great thing about this, you can ask the same question 3 or 4 times, right? And every time their conversation is different because they are speaking with a different class member. But this is just another way to sort of emphasize that idea that each person in this classroom has something important to contribute, and by breaking it down into these smaller segments, you're able to show them, to give them a chance to make that contribution. So that's what I have to say. So yeah, that's my 3 tips.